7, if you want to be turning over there, if you already haven't. Been mentioning the last couple of weeks, of course, we finished up last week the book of 1 Samuel, and the way that the outline for our studies go, they kind of switch back and forth. So we previously studied some of the life of Jesus, but now we're picking up at a point where we left off. If you pay attention to the number on your sheets, I did go from 3:12 to 3:14. That was not by accident. I think I've mentioned before, these lessons have built-in reviews in them, and so 3:13 would actually have been a review kind of about Jesus, but I've chosen not to do those reviews for better or worse. So my mom, she kind of keeps up with these things online. She texts me this week and say, "Hey, did you miss a number?" She's done that before, and I did actually miss a number. So I do from time to time mess up, but this is not one of those times. So we did go from 3:12 to 3:14. We're going to be looking at Mark chapter 7, verses 1 through 30, and talk about, of course, what we find there. The introduction question for tonight is a question that revolves around tradition. And the question is, what are some of the quote, unquote, holy traditions in the Lord's church today? And of course, by holy traditions, I simply mean some traditions that maybe men have adopted over the years that they hold as very sacred, maybe even holy, sometimes even equate them with the commandments of the Lord. So what are some of those holy traditions in the Lord's church today? Do we have any? Okay. 3 songs and a prayer. So what would you describe that as? Maybe the order of services? Is that sometimes considered a written in stone thing in some congregations? You know, it has to be this way. You have to do songs before you do the prayer. Maybe you have to do communion after the lesson instead of before the sermon on Sunday mornings. Some congregations do that. So order of services. What else? Anything else? Times of our services. Yeah, that's one of those I wrote down. In fact, I was talking to a member of the Lord's church this week, and he was telling me how their congregation had recently discussed changing some of their service times, and their elders had decided that they were going to go ahead and do that on a Sunday evening. They were going to change their service time, and he said there were a couple of the members of that congregation that actually came in tears pleading with the elders not to do that. And when the elders asked them why, they said, "Well, we've just always met at this time. You know, that's just the way we've always done it." Not any real good reason, just kind of tradition, right? Doesn't matter what time we assemble on the first day of the week. No, there's not a set time. As long as it's the first day of the week, it's in accordance with Scripture, isn't it? So that's one of those things that some people hold as, you know, the holy time, certain time we're supposed to assemble. What else?
Sunday evening.
What about the number of services on Sunday? How many times are we supposed to take the Lord's Supper and give? And how many times does God command us to sing and study His Word and to pray? You know, is that something you have to do twice on Sunday? Is that a holy commandment? No, it's just a tradition that men have come up with. AM service and a PM service. And as long as you do what God tells you to do on the first day of the week, I mean, you fulfilled your obligations. Now, I'm not going to say there's not a benefit in assembling twice on the first day of the week, but I certainly also would say it's not commanded. It's not something that God said you had to do. So it is a holy tradition that we've adopted. What else? Anything else? Bible study. Yeah. Do you have to have a midweek Bible study? Does it have to be on Wednesday night if you did? Could be on Monday night or Tuesday or maybe even Friday.
No, I thought that was based on the example of the early church that they did meet midweek. It was something the New Testament about getting together.
No, there's no commandment in the New Testament. The only commandment that we could say that it fulfills in a way is studying. I mean, we are commanded to do that, aren't we? Studying God's Word. Yes, sir?
Versions of the Bible.
Oh, versions of the Bible, right? There's another one. Some people have it written in stone. There's only one version that was from the very beginning, and that's the only one you can use, right?
That's what Paul used.
Yeah, Paul used the original English version. So, which one was that, the original English? Was that the Wycliffe?
I had somebody tell me the King James was inspired.
Well, where it's translated correctly, it is. Yes. just like any other version. So, you know, the point is, there's a lot of things that sometimes, even in the Lord's church, I think we know what the Bible teaches about the traditions of men, and I think we'd all stand by that. But sometimes, even as members of the Lord's church, that we fall into the idea or the trap, you know, that there's some man-made traditions that are sacred, that are holy, that even sometimes we equate them with being what God commanded us to do. Yeah, I mean, we can fall into that trap too. So what we're studying tonight, or about tonight, is some holy traditions that the Jews and the Pharisees and the scribes held to. And when you think about the Jews and the Pharisees and the scribes during the days of Jesus, did they have any holy traditions? They had all kinds of them, didn't they? They had all these man-made ideas and appointments and commandments that they equated with being God's word, didn't they? They equated with being, if you didn't do this, then that was sinful in nature. And so that's what we want to think about tonight. And of course, I always say when we study the New Testament, to me, it's a lot easier to make application for me when you go through a lesson, because it just seems like all of it is relevant. You know, sometimes when you study an Old Testament story, you're trying to draw points and ideas out of that story and say, well, this is what they did way back then. How does that apply to us today? But I always find it a lot easier when we're studying the New Testament. So this is one of those lessons, again, I think, where the application is pretty obvious as we read and study this story. So question number 2 here on your handout, as you're reading there through Mark chapter 7, what holy tradition did the Pharisees and the teachers or the scribes of the law notice that Jesus and his disciples didn't observe? Yeah, it was the washing of hands, or eating food with unwashed hands. Eating food with what they would describe as defiled hands. And so the Pharisees and the scribes had this holy tradition that before you ate, you were supposed to wash your hands. And not only were you supposed to wash your hands, but they had a lot of different ideas and laws surrounding exactly how it should be done and how it had to be done in order for you to be clean. Now, let me ask you this question. What was this tradition based upon? Okay, it came from the Jewish elders, yeah. But where did they get it? Why did they come up with something like this?
Wasn't there a place they were supposed to wash the fingertips before they took the shoulder?
Yeah, well, it's based upon Scripture. I mean, it's based upon a commandment that God gave for the priests who were ministering or serving in the tabernacle and the temple. And I'm going to go back. It's found in Exodus chapter 30, and I'm just going to read verses 19 and 20. You can turn over there if you want. If not, you can just listen. But here's what God says, Exodus 30, 19 and 20. For Aaron and his sons shall wash their hands and their feet in water from it. Remember the brazen laver, the laver of water that was set in front of the tabernacle and the temple? Well, before they entered into the tabernacle, they were supposed to wash themselves. They were supposed to wash their hands and to wash their feet. And then in verse 20 it says, when they go into the tabernacle of meeting, or when they come near the altar to minister, to burn an offering made by fire to the Lord, they shall wash with water, lest they die. And so I think what the Jews did is they said, hey, if this is a good commandment for the priest, probably be a good commandment for us too. So before we do anything, before we eat anything, we need to be sure that we wash thoroughly. Now, what's interesting, if you look back in Mark chapter 7, I find it interesting how they translate this. Let's see. I'm trying to find the scripture here. Okay, verse 3. Somebody read to me from the King James Version, Mark 7, verse 3.
For the Pharisees and all the Jews, except they wash their hands off, eat not holy tradition of the elders.
Okay, the King James Version, the translators of the King James Version translated this Greek word as off or often. So the idea is that, as you read that version, is that they wash their hands often. Well, the Greek language is interesting because it literally means a fist. And that seems kind of weird when you think about washing your hands. But the New King James Version translates it this way. They wash their hands in a special way. And I think that's what the Greek is indicating to us. It wasn't that you could just take your hands and dip them in water and then you're good. You washed them. You actually had to ball your hands up, make a fist, so to speak, and make sure that you thoroughly washed your hands before they would consider you clean. Now, you had the Torah, which was the law of God, and then you had the Mishnah that the Jews held very sacred too. And the Mishnah was basically a Jewish rabbi or Jewish teacher's commentary on what the law meant. And they held that commentary in great esteem. What's interesting is when you go back and you look at the Jewish Mishnah, the laws surrounding the washing of their hands, there's over 4,000 words that were written about this special ceremony of washing their hands. And you read through it, I wrote down a few of the things. The amount of water, there was a certain amount of water that you had to have in order to have properly washed your hands. The posture of your hands during that washing, as we talked about, the fist, that was very important, or else you wouldn't have been considered clean. Even the direction of the flow of the water that you used was important. They said if you let the water run from your fingertips down to your elbow, that wasn't washing off the dirt, that's just washing it down your arm. So you have to be sure you let it run from your elbow down to the tip of your fingers so all that uncleanness dripped off of you. And, of course, there's many other things or many other ideas that are associated with that. And so this was to them a holy tradition, wasn't it? You didn't do this, then you weren't doing what's right. And you had violated God's law. And I also want to point this out, they were on a fault-finding mission to start with, weren't they? I mean, that's what they were looking for when they were watching Jesus and his disciples. They were trying to find something that they did that was wrong, that they could put blame upon them, that they could discredit them in the eyes of the people. And so this is one of those things that they picked up upon. Okay, so question number 3 is this. How was the practices of Jesus and his disciples different from the Pharisees and the scribes? Yeah, it was night and day difference, right? It wasn't that they just didn't wash their hands properly. They just dipped them in water and didn't make a fist and all. It's that they didn't even wash their hands, So the Jews and the Pharisees and the scribes are looking at this, and what they notice is, hey, this is different. This is different. That's the key word. This is different than how we do it. And that led, of course, to accusations that they made against Jesus and his disciples, where they weren't just doing something that was different, they were doing something that was sinful. They were doing something that was violating law. And I often say, whenever we study these type of lessons, as Christians, we've got to have enough good sense. And I say that in, I don't mean that in a derogatory way in any manner. But we've got to have enough good sense to know the difference between something being sinful and something being different. And there's a great gap between those two things. We talked about, in our introductory question, we talked about some of the things that people do differently. And when we think about things being different, sometimes we automatically equate that with being sinful, don't we? But that's not always the case. Now, it can be, But it's not always, just because something is different doesn't automatically mean that it's sinful in nature. And so, again, one of the things that I think about that's kind of relevant to our day and our age is, I remember when people first started having an all-in-one service on Sunday. You remember that? What was the general reaction in the Lord's church? Oh, that's bad, isn't it? You know, that just shows your lack of spirituality. You know, if you were a more spiritually minded person, then you wouldn't even think about doing something like that. You know, instead of taking all that time and putting it into one service, you divide it up into two and spread it throughout the day. Is it the case that the amount of time we spend, let's just illustrate it this way, singing. Let's say that on the first day of the week, one congregation spends 10 minutes singing, another congregation spends 20 minutes singing. Which one's more spiritual?
I think that depends on what's behind the singing. 5 or 10 minutes that you're sincerely worshiping counts. 3 days and you didn't mean it even.
What did God say to do? Sing. Did he say sing 10 minutes? Did he say sing 20 minutes? Did he say sing 30 minutes? Did he say make a joyful noise with one song? Or 2 songs? Or 3? He just told us to sing, didn't he? And so sometimes in our minds we automatically equate, I think, this idea, well, the longer time you spend doing something, that means you're more spiritually minded. You know, when I think about our Sunday morning Bible classes, they're not very long relatively compared to other congregations. There's a lot of other congregations that have 45 minutes to an hour Bible studies on Sunday morning. Ours is generally, 35 minutes? Is that right? Somewhere in that neighborhood. Does that mean we're less spiritually minded? Does it mean if we had a 45-minute Bible class, we'd be stronger spiritually, or our mindset would be better? Has nothing to do with it, does it? You know, how about a sermon length? Maybe we, instead of preaching 30 minutes on Sunday morning, we do 45, and then we'll be really spiritually minded people, right?
That might be a problem.
Well, what if the preacher only preaches, what if one week he preaches 30 minutes, and then the next week he preaches 20 minutes? Was he more spiritually minded the week before? You see the foolishness of thinking? You know, it's this idea or this concept, though, that we often fall into. And when we look at something that somebody else does and it's different than what we do, a lot of times we automatically say that can't be right. You know? But just because it's different doesn't necessarily mean that it's sinful. It's okay to have a personal preference, you know, but we have to understand it's not okay to condemn other people for not following our personal preference. And was it okay for the scribes and the Pharisees to wash their hands before they ate? Was that sinful? Probably a good idea, wasn't it? It's probably good hygiene. But could they make and command other people to do it? Could they say it's sinful if they didn't? No. And so that's what we have to understand. We've got to have enough good sense to see the difference between something being sinful and something being different. So the Pharisees were famous for using these man-made traditions as holy commandments, or labeling them as holy things given to them by God. So they accused Jesus and his disciples of doing something that was not right. So question number 4 is this: what did Jesus accuse the Pharisees of? Yeah, and what did he call them? He said, "You're hypocrites." What did he mean by that?
It means they said they were holy, but they're actually the opposite.
Yeah, why did they do this? I mean, why were they washing their hands before they ate?
They were trying to outlaw holy.
They were trying to give the appearance that they were very religious people, weren't they? That they were spiritually minded individuals. That they were holy. They were different from everybody else. But Jesus says, you know, you're trying to give this appearance to everybody else that you're so devoted, that you're such a religiously minded and spiritually minded individual, but you're not. You know, when it comes to the actual commands of God, you have more respect for man-made traditions than you do for the commands of God himself. And so you're putting out this hypocritical appearance to everybody else. So how were the Pharisees being hypocritical in this instance? Let's just combine questions 5 and 6 here. What example does Jesus use to prove this accusation that he made against them? Okay, it had to do with the commandment of God. And what commandment of God was that? Yeah, one of the things that the Bible teaches us is we're supposed to show honor for our mothers and our fathers. And of course that begins at a young age within the home as children being obedient to them, but it also extends to their older age. And the Bible tells us that we're supposed to honor our mothers and our fathers even when they grow older. So if they need something financially, what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to take care of it. The Bible calls it, I think Paul calls it, is it 1 Timothy, where he says, repaying your parents? You know, what'd they do for us when we were little? Well, they took care of us, didn't they? They provided for us, changed our diapers, gave us something to eat, you know, all those things. And so when they grow older and they need somebody to care for them, it's our duty as children to help them. So if they need help financially, we're supposed to be there. If they need help with their everyday health and physical care, we're supposed to be sure that's taken care of, aren't we? Do we need to visit them? Yeah, all those things. I mean, all of that is showing honor for your mother and for your father. So that's what God's law tells us to do. But the Jews had came up with a man-made tradition. And that tradition was, if your father or your mother, you had something, they said, hey, I could really use that. You know, or I really need that right now. That would help me. You could just say Corban, which meant what? It's a gift to God. In other words, I've pledged this item or I've pledged this money to God, and so I can't take it away from God and give it to you. And if you said Corban in the mind of the Jew, what did that do? What's Jesus say?
You'd be free.
Yeah, you're free. You don't have to show honor for your mother and father, right? And so they come up with this man-made tradition in order to nullify the commandment that God gave. And so that was the illustration that Jesus gave. He said, you guys are such hypocrites. You know, here's a full-fledged, easy, understand commandment of God. And instead of following it, instead of being showing people how religiously devoted you are, how spiritually minded you are, how concerned with the commandments of God you are, you've found a way to try to circumvent that. You've found a way to try to create a loophole in this law that God has given to you. And so that man-made tradition in their mind, that triumphed over this law of God. It superseded it. So think about this. They used their traditions to justify sin, justify breaking a commandment of God. So it showed really what kind of people they were.
You think it might be even worse than that, to use God as an excuse to break God's law?
Yeah, and that's all it was. I mean, and here's the thing about it. You know, they would say, well, whatever this item is, I can't give it to you, but I can use it until I give it to God. So I can use it for my advantage. I can, you know, take care of it or do whatever with it until it comes time that I give it to God. But I can't give it to you and let you use it because it belongs to Him. Well, that's, again, just shows what really was within their heart, doesn't it? Really shows what kind of character, what kind of people they were. So Jesus used that example. Boy, we're going to have to fast forward here. How does, what kind of parable or this parable that Jesus uses, what is the main principle that it teaches here? He tells his disciples and the people a parable. How would you summarize it?
Now, what goes into the mouth?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it is more worried about things like that that comes out of the heart. That's what runs us all. The thoughts of man, the spirit of man, whatever you want to call the heart there. Their heart is there when that.
Yeah, they were really worried about the physical, weren't they? The outside of man. And so their thought was, you eat a piece of dirt, that makes you dirty, right? Because it went into your stomach, and that's what defiles the man. Jesus said, that's not what defiles the man, because what you put in your mouth comes out. Okay, that doesn't automatically make you dirty. What is it that defiles a man? What does it make a man unclean? It's what's inside you, what's really inside you, right? Not just what you ate for supper or for breakfast or lunch. That's not what determines. When you think about what can a person eat according to God's law, what's the answer? What kind of food can you eat today? Is there anything unclean?
Gotta eat cheese.
That's not going to make you unclean. Might clean you out. It's not going to make you unclean.
Well, it's a discussion here, though. In verse 19, at least in this version, it says, thus he declared all food is clean. Now, this is at the time that would still be under the Mosaic law.
Yeah.
And so was he declaring it at that time, or just something that they're going to declare? Or is it going because he's marked it basically written the Gentiles?
Yeah. Well, we know that Jesus lived under the law of Moses, but we also know that he prepared the way. He was preparing for the transition into the new.
But it isn't come to them until Peter goes.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's still the same principle under the law of Moses, isn't it? I mean, what are we concerned with today?
Taxes. What do you mean?
I think we're most concerned with physical appearance, don't you? How do people perceive us? What impression do we give other people when they look at us? And our idea is, let's clean the outward up, and then the inside will take care of it. That'll lead to the inside being clean. How did Jesus teach us to do it? What's God most concerned with? It's our heart, isn't it? It's who we are. It's our character. And these people inside, they were wicked people, weren't they? And they were people who would find a loophole in God's law so they didn't have to honor their father and their mother. That's the kind of people they were. And so Jesus is, I think, pointing to this idea with this parable. God's focus is on the inside. When God looks at us, what does he see? He sees the heart, doesn't he? And that's hard for me to understand. That's hard for me to grasp. When I look at somebody, it's hard for me to see the heart. Now, I can do it, but it might take some time and observation. But when God looks at us, he automatically sees who we are. He sees us on the inside. And that's what God's concerned with. What type of person are we? Now, our actions are going to manifest that, aren't they? Just like these people. I mean, they came up with this man-made tradition to circumvent the law of God. It displayed what type of people that they really were. But their focus was all on cleaning up the outside and giving this good appearance to everybody else. And so Jesus is emphasizing here, take care of the inside. You take care of the inside, the outside will follow, won't it? If you're a good person on the inside, you're going to say good things and you're going to do good things. And so that's what's important. So thinking about this, we're going to run out of time here. I'm not going to talk about the woman here in verses 12 and the man in verse 15. But I do want to just end with question 11 here. So how can we guard against practicing this type of tradition-bound religion that Jesus condemned? Again, do you think tradition is a problem in the church today? I wonder what we would think of Jesus today. if he came and walked upon this earth and went in and out among us. You know, you think about Christ and how different he was from a lot of the religiously minded people in that day. He fellowshiped with sinners. Boy, what would you think of a Christian today who fellowshiped with sinners? Yeah. But he spent a lot of time with tax collectors and sinners, didn't he?
And he didn't just say, hi, how you doing? He hung out with them.
He ate with them. He went to their houses. You know, he did things with them. He didn't fast. You know, all these religiously minded people in that day and age, they fasted, didn't they? Christ didn't fast.
I would say today, he would say we were a little overjoyed that.
Well, I mean, think about it. What would we do if we knew somebody who said they were a Christian and we found out that they spent every Friday night down at the tavern hanging out? Not getting drunk, not getting in trouble, they were just hanging out in town.
Yeah. Well, I think the difference in Jesus was he didn't participate in their sinful environments. He would go to their house and associate with them and stuff like that. But
I'm sure he wasn't just talking about it.
yeah.
Well, and I'm not saying drinking, I'm just saying.
Right. Yeah. But what was his attitude toward the Sabbath when compared to everybody else in that day and age?
Sabbath was for service.
It's pretty loose, wasn't it? Everybody else had all these strict laws and, you know, we got to do this, got to do that. Can't do that, can't do this on the Sabbath. You know, just think about Christ. Think about him teaching against all their traditions. What would we think of a person like that today? Probably wouldn't be very well accepted, would he? So Jesus was different than everybody else, and that upset a lot of people in that day and age. But he did teach a very valuable lesson there about the idea of being clean and unclean. The inside determines whether you're clean or unclean. That's the main lesson. All right, anybody got any thoughts, comments, questions?